The air in the Dry Creek saloon was thick enough to taste. A foul stew of cheap whiskey, sweat, and the bitter smoke of roll-your-own tobacco. It clung to the rough-hewn wooden walls and settled in a greasy film on the flickering lanterns that cast long, dancing shadows across the room. For Evelyn Moore, sitting on a hard bench near the back wall, the stench was the smell of the end. She kept her eyes fixed on her worn leather shoes, pretending the scuffs and cracks held some great secret that could save her from the low murmur of male voices and the sharp clatter of poker chips on a scarred pine table. Her father, Thomas Moore, sat at that table. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale and slick with a gambler's sweat. He had once been a man of some standing back east, a man who wore starched collars and spoke of commerce and futures. But the West had stripped him bare, peeled him back layer by layer until all that was left was this desperate, hollowed-out creature who smelled of fear and rye. He was losing, as he always did. The pile of chips in front of him had shrunk to a pathetic mound, a monument to his own ruin. Across the table sat the man who was winning. He did not look like the other ranchers and cowboys, who hooted and slapped their thighs with every turn of a card. This man was still a pillar of silence in the surrounding noise. His name was Caleb Hart, and the whispers that followed him were as stark and unforgiving as the land he worked. He was tall, built of lean muscle and bone, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from sun-baked rock. His hat was pulled low, but the lamplight caught the hard line of his jaw and the deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb the light and give nothing back. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and felt too little for a long, long time. Evelyn watched her father push his last few chips into the center of the table. His hand trembled. "All I have left," he rasped, his voice thin and reedy. Caleb Hart's gaze didn't flicker. He laid his cards down, one by one. A full house. The other men at the table let out a collective groan of sympathy for Thomas. Caleb Hart simply gathered the chips with a slow, deliberate motion, his hands calloused and sure. There was no triumph in his expression, no pleasure. There was nothing at all. "I'm done. Hart, you've cleaned me out," Thomas mumbled, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. Caleb's voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Not quite. More. You owe me from last week, and the week before." He paused, letting the weight of the debt settle in the stale air. $200. A choked sound escaped her father's throat. $200 was a fortune, an impossible sum. He might as well have asked for the moon. "I don't have it. You know I don't." "I know," Caleb said. The single phrase was not an absolution. It was a condemnation. He leaned forward slightly, and the shadows shifted, making his face even harder, more severe. "But you have other assets." His gaze lifted, for the first time, from Thomas Moore. It swept past the other men, past the dusty bar, and landed on Evelyn. It was not the leering look she was used to from men in this town, the kind of look that stripped a woman down in her mind. It was colder, more impersonal. It was the look a man gives a horse he's thinking of buying, assessing its teeth and its legs. Evelyn felt a chill crawl up her spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. She felt herself shrink, become a thing, an asset. Her father followed Caleb's gaze, and a terrible, dawning shame filled his eyes. But shame was a luxury he could no longer afford. "My daughter," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Evelyn?" "I need a wife," Caleb stated, as if discussing the need for a new plow. "Someone to run the house, cook, keep things in order." He wasn't asking. He was laying out the terms of a new deal. "She will do. The debt is cleared." The saloon, which had been humming with low chatter, fell utterly silent. Every man in the room turned to look at Evelyn, their faces a mixture of pity and crude curiosity. She was no longer a person. She was a wager. The final, desperate bet of a broken man. Her future was being decided by two men who had never once asked her name, by a debt incurred over whiskey and cards. Her father's shoulders sagged further, the last of his pride draining out of him onto the sawdust-covered floor. He could not meet her eyes. He could not bear to see what he had done. But one of the other ranchers, a stout man named Miller with a sense of crude fair play, spoke up. "Hell, Hart, you can't just take a man's daughter. That ain't right." Caleb's empty gaze shifted to Miller. "He has nothing else to pay with. He gave his word the debt would be settled tonight. This settles it." His eyes returned to Thomas Moore, who flinched. "Unless you'd rather face the sheriff for the seed you borrowed from my barn last spring." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Thomas Moore's face went from pale to ashen. He was trapped, and he had pulled his daughter into the trap with him. He looked at Evelyn then, a pathetic, pleading look that begged for an understanding she could not give. Caleb Hart seemed to grow bored of the proceedings. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a silver dollar. It shone dully in the lamplight. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger. "Fine," he said to her father. "We'll let fate decide. Call it." He flipped the coin into the air. It spun, a silver blur, catching the light as it rose and fell. Time seemed to slow. Evelyn heard the blood pounding in her ears. The coin was her life, her future, her soul, tumbling through the smoky air of a saloon. "Heads!" her father choked out. The coin landed on the table with a sharp, definitive crack. It spun for a moment, wobbled, and then lay still. Caleb Hart did not even need to look down. His eyes were fixed on Thomas Moore. "Tails," he said, his voice flat. He scooped up the coin and pushed his chair back from the table. The scrape of the wood against the floorboards was the sound of a gavel falling. A sentence passed. He rose to his full height, a long shadow in the dim light. He walked around the table, his steps measured and heavy, and stopped not in front of Evelyn, but beside her. He did not look at her. He spoke to the air just over her head. "Go pack what little you own," he commanded. "The wagon is outside. I am not a patient man." Then he turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving behind a dead silence and the wreckage of Evelyn's life. The wagon ride was a journey through a world bleached of color and sound. The vast, sun-scorched plains of the West stretched out in every direction, a seemingly endless expanse of dry grass and cracked earth under a sky so wide and blue it felt like a weight. The only sounds were the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels, the soft sigh of the wind stirring the dust, and the steady plod of the two horses pulling them forward. It was a silence that was not peaceful, but empty, a void that seemed to swallow all words before they could be spoken. Evelyn sat on the hard wooden seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap around the small cloth bundle that contained everything she owned: one spare dress, a brush, and a small, tattered Bible her mother had given her years ago. She had not cried. The shock was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, and tears felt like a weakness she could not afford. Instead, she watched the man beside her. Caleb Hart held the reins loosely, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he were steering them toward the edge of the world. He had not spoken a single word to her since they had left Dry Creek. He had not looked at her. It was as if she were another sack of grain he was hauling back to his ranch, a piece of cargo that required no acknowledgement. She studied his profile, trying to read the story written in the harsh lines of his face. He was younger than she had first thought in the saloon's gloom, perhaps not yet 30, but he carried the weariness of a much older man. There were fine lines etched at the corners of his eyes, not from laughter, but from squinting into the relentless sun, or perhaps from staring down things she could not imagine. A pale, thin scar ran from his temple down to his jaw, a white line against his weathered skin that spoke of some past violence. His hands on the reins were steady and capable, the knuckles scarred, the skin rough. They were the hands of a man who knew nothing but work and hardship. He was tall and rough, and as distant as the purple mountains that shimmered in the far-off heat. He was her husband. The thought was so absurd, so monstrous, that a hysterical laugh almost bubbled up in her throat. She swallowed it down, choking on the bitterness. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its zenith, beating down with a merciless intensity. The heat was a physical presence, pressing on her, stealing the moisture from her skin and the breath from her lungs. She had never known such heat, such emptiness. Back east, the world was green and close, full of trees and hills and the comforting presence of people. Here, the world was wide open, exposed, and utterly indifferent. You could scream, and the only thing that would hear you was the wind. Finally, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red, a shape emerged from the shimmering haze. It was a small homestead, a collection of buildings that looked as lonely and weathered as the man who owned them. A simple wooden house, a larger barn, and a series of corrals sat on a piece of land that seemed to have surrendered to the drought. The earth was bare and cracked in patches, the grass thin and yellowed. A few skeletal trees stood guard over the property, their branches twisted and bare. This was his ranch. This was her new home. As they drew closer, Evelyn saw that the place was not just scarred by drought, but by a profound silence. There were no chickens scratching in the yard, no dog barking a welcome, no sign of life at all, save for a few cattle moving slowly in a distant pasture. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath. The porch sagged slightly, and the windows were dark, like vacant eyes staring out at nothing. It was a place steeped in sorrow, a landscape of grief. Caleb pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the house, and finally, he turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, gray and unreadable. "This is it," he said. His voice was devoid of any emotion. No pride, no welcome, nothing. He got down from the wagon and began to unhitch the horses, his movements economical and precise. He did not offer her a hand. Evelyn climbed down on her own, her legs stiff from the long ride. She stood in the yard, clutching her small bundle, and looked around. She felt trapped. The vast, open wilderness that surrounded her offered no escape, only a different kind of prison, one without walls. And inside the house, she sensed another prison, one built of grief and silence, and its walls were far more formidable. That night, the world came alive with sound. The wind moaned around the corners of the small house, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry the loneliness of the plains within it. And from the darkness came the high, yipping howls of coyotes, a wild and chilling chorus that spoke of hunger and survival. Evelyn lay on a narrow cot in a small, spare room, staring up at a ceiling she could not see. The mattress was thin, stuffed with straw that rustled with every small movement. The air was cold. He had shown her to the room, pointed to the bed, and then left without another word. He had eaten his own meal of beans and stale bread in silence at the main table, then retired to a different room at the other end of the house. The distance between them was a physical chasm. She lay there, listening to the coyotes, and felt a tremor of fear, deep and primal. She was alone, utterly alone, in a strange house with a man who was a stranger to her, a man who had bought her like a piece of a livestock. The fear was a living thing, threatening to swallow her whole. But then another feeling rose to meet it, something hard and stubborn that had taken root in her soul. She thought of her father's weak, pleading eyes, of the men's stares in the saloon, of the cold finality of the coin hitting the table. She had been treated like she was nothing. She had been broken down into a commodity. But she was still Evelyn Moore. She still had a name, a mind, a spirit. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her temple into her hair. She wiped it away with an angry gesture. They could take her freedom. They could sell her future, but they could not have her soul. As the coyotes howled their lonely song to the moon, she whispered the words into the darkness. a promise to herself. I will not break. The days that followed fell into a rigid, unspoken routine. Caleb Hart treated her with a cold and distant civility. He rose before dawn, and the sound of him stoking the fire in the main room was her alarm clock. When she emerged, there was always coffee boiling on the stove and a portion of food left for her on the table, oatmeal or biscuits, simple fare that he had prepared. He would already be gone, out tending to the cattle or mending fences, a solitary figure moving against the vast backdrop of his land. He never called her Evelyn. From the first morning, he referred to her, when he had to refer to her at all, as Mrs. Hart. The name felt like a costume she was forced to wear, one that was both too large and too confining. It was a title, not a name. It designated her role in his house, and nothing more. She was the wife, the housekeeper, the cook. She was not a person. She learned about his past by accident. A week into her new life, a wagon approached the ranch, a rare and startling sight. It was a neighbor, a widow named Agnes Miller, who lived on a spread a few miles to the east. She was a stout woman with kind, sad eyes and hands that were as gnarled and tough as old tree roots. She had brought a small sack of flour and some dried apples, a gesture of welcome. "Saw you in town the other day," Agnes said, her voice direct and without preamble as she sat at the kitchen table with Evelyn. "Figured you could use some company? It gets quiet out here." Evelyn, starved for human contact, felt a rush of gratitude so strong it almost brought her to tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. Agnes just nodded, her gaze taking in the Spartan cleanliness of the house. "Caleb keeps a tidy place, always has." She paused, then looked at Evelyn with a searching expression. "He's a hard man, but he wasn't always this way." And then, in a plain, unadorned telling, the story came out. "He had a wife before," Agnes said softly. "Her name was Martha, a sweet girl, bright as a new penny. They were happy as folks can be in a place like this. Then, about 2 years back, the Comanche came. It wasn't a big raid, just a small band, desperate for horses. Caleb was out on the range, checking the far fences. He was gone 2 days. When he came back," Agnes's voice trailed off, and she looked out the window toward a small, fenced-off patch of ground on a low hill behind the house. Evelyn had noticed it before, a single wooden cross marking the earth. "He found her here, in the house. He buried her himself, up on that hill." The widow's words hung in the air, explaining everything and nothing. It explained the silence in the house, the grief that clung to the walls like dust. It explained the haunted look in Caleb's eyes. He wasn't just a hard man. He was a man hollowed out by loss. "He hasn't been the same since," Agnes finished, her voice heavy with pity. "He closed himself off. It's like he buried a part of himself up there with her." The first emotional fracture, the first sign that there was something more than just ice beneath Caleb's surface, came a few days later. He was in the barn, trying to repair a broken leather harness. Evelyn had brought him a dipper of cool water from the well. As she approached, she saw him curse under his breath and pull his hand back sharply. He had been using a sharp awl, and it had slipped, slicing a deep, clean cut across the back of his hand. Blood, dark and rich, welled up instantly, dripping onto the dusty floor. Without thinking, driven by some instinct for compassion that she had thought long dead, Evelyn set the dipper down and reached for his hand. "Here," she said softly. "Let me help you. We need to wrap that." The moment her fingers brushed against his skin, he flinched as if he'd been burned. He yanked his hand away, his whole body going rigid. He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes other than emptiness. It was a flash of raw, agonizing pain, followed by a look of sheer panic, like a cornered animal. "Don't," he rasped, his voice a low, guttural whisper. He cradled his injured hand against his chest, shielding it from her. He looked at her, at her outstretched hand, as if it were a weapon. He took a step back, his face a mask of torment. "Don't touch what you don't understand," he whispered, the words ragged and torn from some deep, wounded place inside him. Then he turned and walked away, out of the barn and into the blinding sunlight, leaving her standing alone in the shadows, her hand still hovering in the empty air. Evelyn stood there for a long time, the echo of his words ringing in her ears. Don't touch what you don't understand. He wasn't talking about the cut. He was talking about himself, about the scars that ran far deeper than the one on his face. She looked down at his blood on the floor, a few dark red drops that were already beginning to dry in the dust, and in that moment, she began to realize the truth. His silence was not a wall built of coldness or cruelty. It was a fortress, built brick by painful brick to contain an unbearable guilt. He wasn't just mourning his dead wife. He was punishing himself for her death, and he was determined to serve his sentence alone. Life on the Hart Ranch was a brutal education, taught by a curriculum of hard labor and unrelenting sun. Evelyn, who had once prided herself on her embroidery, now learned the harsh language of physical work. The rhythm of her days was dictated by the needs of the land and the animals, a rhythm that was steady, unforgiving, and utterly indifferent to her own past. She learned that silence was not empty, but filled with the sounds of survival, the groan of the well pump, the nicker of a horse wanting grain, the whisper of the wind that was a constant companion. She tried to fit into this rhythm, to bend her own will to it before it broke her. She rose in the pre-dawn chill to feed the two sturdy horses that were the ranch's lifeblood, her arms aching from the weight of the grain buckets. She learned to haul water from the well, two heavy pails that banged against her legs and stretched the muscles in her back until they screamed. The rough wood of the handle chafed her palms raw. At first, blisters rose, pale and tender. Then they broke, leaving angry red sores that stung with every movement. Her soft city hands, accustomed to holding nothing heavier than a teacup, began to bleed. She would wrap them in strips torn from an old petticoat at night, but by midday, the blood would have seeped through, staining the bucket handles and the fence posts she tried to mend. Caleb watched her efforts from a distance, his face impassive. He offered no help and no praise, but he left a small tin of salve on the kitchen table one morning without a word. It smelled of pine and lanolin. Evelyn used it gratefully, her cheeks burning with a mixture of humiliation and a strange, reluctant gratitude. She was learning that in this world, kindness was not spoken. It was a silent, practical thing. Her greatest test, however, came not from the land, but from the people who lived on it. Once a month, Caleb made the long trip into Dry Creek for supplies. On the second of these trips, he gestured for her to join him on the wagon. The journey was as silent as her first, but this time, Evelyn was not a terrified girl. She was a woman girded for a battle she knew was coming. Dry Creek had not forgotten the circumstances of her arrival. As she walked beside Caleb down the town's single dusty street, she felt the eyes on her. Windows twitched with movement. Conversations on the boardwalks dropped to hushed whispers as they passed. The women were the worst. They stared from behind the windows of the general store, their faces tight with judgment, their eyes cold and assessing. They saw her fine-boned features, her dress that, though worn, still hinted at a life less harsh than their own. And they saw a threat, an outsider. Inside the store, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, leather, and condescension. The storekeeper's wife, a woman with a pinched face and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her eyes into narrow slits, served them. As she tallied up their flour and salt, she looked Evelyn up and down, a slow, deliberate inspection that was meant to wound. "Heard you got yourself a housekeeper, Caleb," the woman said, her voice carrying a sharp, sneering edge that cut through the quiet store. She did not look at Evelyn as she spoke about her. "And a bargain at that. Must be nice, settling a gambling debt and getting a wife in the same toss of a coin." Her thin lips curled into a cruel smile. Bought cheap, I suppose. The insult landed like a physical blow. Evelyn felt the heat rise in her face, a tide of shame and fury. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, to scream that she was a person, not a piece of property. But the words caught in her throat. Caleb, standing beside her, gave no reaction. His face remained a stony mask. He simply paid the woman, his movements unhurried, took their supplies, and walked out. Evelyn followed him, her body trembling. She felt utterly exposed, stripped bare in the middle of that dusty street. He had not defended her. He had not even acknowledged the insult. As they rode away from the town, the silence in the wagon was heavier than ever before, filled with the words that had been spoken and the words that had not. She understood then that in the eyes of this world, she was his possession, and her shame was his to ignore. That Sunday, a profound loneliness settled over her. She heard the distant sound of a church bell ringing in Dry Creek, a faint, hopeful peal on the wind. It reminded her of a life that was no longer hers, a life of community and shared faith. "We should go to church," she said to Caleb as he sat cleaning a rifle at the table. It was the first time she had initiated a conversation about anything other than the immediate needs of the ranch. He did not look up from his work. He ran an oil-soaked cloth down the long barrel, his movements methodical. "No," he said. The word was flat, final. "It would be good," she persisted, her voice small but determined. "To be around people, to pray." He finally stopped his work and lifted his head. His gray eyes were cold, hard chips of flint. "I have no use for God," he said, his voice low and laced with a bitterness that startled her. "Nor people." He went back to cleaning his rifle, the soft scrape of the cloth against the metal the only sound in the room. The conversation was over. He had built a wall not only around his heart, but around their entire existence, isolating them from heaven and earth alike. Days later, while cleaning the small, grim house, she found his wall had a crack in it, tucked away on a high shelf, covered in a fine layer of dust, was a Bible. It was much larger and older than her own, bound in dark, cracked leather. It felt heavy in her hands, a repository of history. She opened it carefully. The pages were brittle, the corners softened with use. It fell open to the Psalms, to a page that was clearly read more often than the others. The paper was smudged with fingerprints, the verses underlined in faint pencil. A psalm about forgiveness. "For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us." And tucked between those pages, like a pressed flower, was a small, faded photograph. It was a portrait of a woman. She was young, with a kind, open face and a gentle smile that seemed to light up her eyes. Her hair was piled high on her head in a soft, fashionable style that spoke of a time before hardship had settled in. She looked full of life, of hope. This was Martha, the ghost that haunted the house. Evelyn stared at the photograph for a long time. She felt a strange mix of emotions, a pang of jealousy for the smiling woman who had known a different Caleb, a wave of pity for the life that had been so brutally cut short, and a deep, aching curiosity. This woman was the key to understanding the man she was married to. She was the source of his guilt, the center of his grief. That evening, she found the courage to approach him. He was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, his face cast in flickering orange light. The Bible was on the table beside her. "I found this," she said softly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "And the photograph?" He tensed, his whole body going still. He did not turn to look at her. "She was beautiful," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "Martha." The name, spoken aloud in that silent house, was like a stone thrown into a still pond. The air vibrated with it. For a moment, Caleb did not move. Then, he rose from his chair in a single, violent motion. He turned to face her, and his eyes were no longer empty. They were blazing with a furious, desperate pain. "You have no right," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You have no right to speak her name. You know nothing." He strode to the table, snatched the Bible, and for a terrifying moment, Evelyn thought he might strike her with it. Instead, he turned to the fireplace, and with a guttural cry that sounded as if it were ripped from his very soul, he threw the book into the heart of the flames. The fire hissed and spat as it consumed the dry pages. The leather cover curled and blackened. Evelyn watched, horrified, as the image of the smiling woman was swallowed by the fire. As the words of forgiveness turned to ash, Caleb stood with his back to her, his shoulders heaving, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had not just burned a book. He had burned his only bridge to the past, his only hope for absolution. It was during this time that a ranch hand, an old, wiry man named Tom, who came by twice a year to help with the branding, appeared. He had known Caleb for years and saw the new, fragile dynamic of the household with his wise, sun-crinkled eyes. He found Evelyn one afternoon by the chicken coop, her hands wrapped in their customary rags. "He's a good man, ma'am," Tom said, his voice raspy from a lifetime of dust and tobacco. "Underneath it all." He nodded toward the house. "What he did with that Bible, that wasn't about you." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "He ain't cruel, ma'am. He's just drowning in ghosts. And a drowning man will pull anyone under with him if you get too close." Tom's words stayed with her, a small piece of understanding to hold on to in the vast sea of silence and rage. A drowning man. It was the truest description of Caleb Hart she had ever heard. The storm came without warning one night in late summer. It rolled in from the west, a great bruised wall of cloud that swallowed the stars and turned the air heavy and electric. The wind rose first, a low moan that grew into a frantic shriek, rattling the windows in their frames. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered against the roof like 1,000 angry fists. Evelyn woke to the first deafening clap of thunder. It shook the little house to its foundations. Lightning bleached the room white for a split second, and, in the ensuing darkness, the fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She lay there, listening to the storm's fury, and realized the house was too quiet. Caleb was not in his room. Driven by an instinct she did not understand, she lit a lantern. The small flame flickered wildly, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. She walked through the house, calling his name, but the only answer was the howl of the wind. The main door was unlatched, swinging slightly in the gale. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped out onto the porch. The wind and rain hit her with a physical force, stealing her breath and plastering her thin nightgown to her skin. The world was a chaotic nightmare of sound and fury. And then, in the next brilliant flash of lightning, she saw him. He was outside, in the heart of the storm, kneeling by the small, fenced-in grave on the hill. Martha's grave. The rain was lashing down on him, soaking his hair and clothes. But he seemed oblivious to it. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter desolation. He was a man stripped of all his defenses, his grief raw and exposed under the violent sky. Another instinct, stronger than her fear of the storm, stronger than her fear of him, took hold of her. She went back inside, grabbed a heavy wool blanket from his bed, and plunged back out into the maelstrom. The mud sucked at her bare feet as she fought her way up the small hill, the wind tearing at her, the lantern swinging wildly, its light a small, defiant beacon in the overwhelming darkness. She reached the grave, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He did not seem to notice her. He was lost in his own private hell. She knelt down beside him in the mud and the rain. She did not speak. There were no words for this kind of pain. Instead, she did the one thing she knew she could do. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it gently on his shoulder. He flinched, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through his entire body. But he did not pull away. He did not move at all. He just remained there, kneeling in the mud, as the rain poured down over both of them. A fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating them in a stark, unearthly light. Two lonely figures kneeling at a grave, bound together by a grief that was his and a compassion that was hers. In that shared, silent moment, under the watchful, violent eye of the storm, a fragile connection was forged. A thread of understanding spun from their mutual loneliness. They stayed that way for a long time, as the storm raged and finally, slowly began to recede. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The air was cool and fresh, and the rising sun set the damp earth sparkling. The storm had passed. Evelyn was in the kitchen, stoking the fire, her body sore and chilled to the bone. She heard him enter, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. She did not turn around, bracing herself for the usual silence. He stopped a few feet behind her. She could feel his presence, the weight of it in the room. She waited. "Evelyn." He spoke her name, just her name. It was not the cold, formal Mrs. Hart. It was her name, spoken in his low, rough voice. It was quiet, tentative, but it was there. It was an acknowledgement, an apology, a beginning. She turned slowly to look at him. He was standing there, his clothes still damp, his face pale and drawn, but the wild, haunted look in his eyes was gone. In its place was a profound weariness, and something else, something she had never seen there before. It was a flicker of light in the depths of his long darkness. Evelyn's heart, which had felt like a cold, hard stone in her chest for so long, gave a small, painful lurch, and for the first time since she had arrived in this barren, loveless land, she began to hope. The hope that had flickered to life within Evelyn was a fragile thing, and the weeks that followed did everything they could to extinguish it. The drought, which had been a quiet threat, became an active malevolence. The sky turned a pale, hazy white, bled of all color and moisture. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the land until the earth cracked open in a network of deep fissures, like a body in pain. The wind, once a mournful singer, became a hot, rasping breath that carried only dust. The creek that ran through Caleb's property dwindled to a muddy trickle and then vanished altogether, leaving a scar of bleached stones in its wake. The grass turned from yellow to a brittle, lifeless brown. The cattle, their ribs showing like washboards beneath their hides, grew weak. They would stand for hours with their heads hung low, too weary to even flick the flies from their eyes. Then, one by one, they began to die. Caleb would find them in the mornings, still and silent in the baked pastures. He would drag the carcasses to a ravine far from the house, his face a mask of grim resolve, the muscles in his jaw tight. Each death was a fresh wound to the ranch, and to the man who was tied to it. The well near the house, their lifeline, grew shallow. The water they drew became gritty with silt, then thinned to a muddy sludge. One morning, the bucket came up empty, scraping against the bottom with a hollow, final sound. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any storm. Caleb stood staring into the dry well for a long moment, his hands on his hips. Evelyn watched him from the porch, her own throat tight with thirst and fear. She expected an outburst of rage, a curse against the cruel sky. Instead, he simply turned, his face set like stone. "Get the shovels," he said. He had chosen a spot on a low-lying patch of ground where a few stubborn willows still clung to a semblance of life. He believed there was water there, deep down. For the next week, they dug. The work was brutal, soul-crushing labor under the relentless sun. Caleb worked like a man possessed, his muscles straining as he drove the shovel into the hard, unforgiving earth, his body slick with sweat. Evelyn worked beside him. At first, he seemed not to want her help, but she ignored his silent disapproval. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth. hitched up the skirts of her oldest dress, and picked up the second shovel. She was not as strong as him, but she was stubborn. She scooped out the loose dirt he broke apart, hauling it away in a bucket, her arms and back screaming in protest. The sun beat down on her, burning her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. The dust coated her face and filled her lungs. The blisters on her hands, which had just begun to heal, broke open again, raw and weeping. She refused to stop. She worked until her vision swam and her muscles trembled with exhaustion. She saw this not just as a fight for water, but as a fight for her own place in this world. She would not be the helpless woman from the city. She would be a partner in this struggle. In the evenings, they would fall into their beds, too tired to eat, their bodies aching, and rise again before dawn to the same back-breaking work. They barely spoke, but a new kind of communication grew between them in the shared rhythm of their labor, the clang of a shovel against rock, the grunt of effort, the shared sip of their dwindling water supply. He began to leave the water canteen closer to her side. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. They were nearly 15 feet down when it happened. The sun was setting, painting the bruised sky in shades of blood, orange and purple. Evelyn was hauling a bucket of dirt from the hole when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She looked up, shielding her eyes against the glare. A group of 5 riders was coming toward the ranch, their figures dark silhouettes against the dying light. Caleb climbed out of the pit, his movements suddenly tense and alert. He stood beside her, his body a rigid line. As he watched the men approach, they were ranchers from a neighboring spread, their faces gaunt and etched with the same desperation that haunted their own land. The man in the lead, a big, bearded man named Henderson, stopped his horse a few yards away. "Hart," Henderson said, his voice a low growl. "Our wells are dry. Our cattle are dying. We hear you still have a few head with some life in them." "They're my cattle," Caleb replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "We are not asking," Henderson said, and his hand moved to rest on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. The other men shifted in their saddles, their eyes hard and greedy. Tempers, frayed by heat and thirst and loss, were about to snap. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. She looked at Caleb, and the man she saw was not the silent, grieving rancher she had come to know. In the space of a heartbeat, he had transformed. His posture changed, his weariness falling away to be replaced by a cold, coiled readiness. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, supplanted by a flat, chilling focus. It was the look of a soldier on a battlefield, a man who understood violence as a language. "You ride out now," Caleb said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "And this ends here." Henderson laughed, a short, ugly sound. "There are 5 of us, Hart, and 1 of you." He never finished the thought. Caleb moved with a speed that was terrifying. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, grabbing the shovel he had been using. He did not swing it like a club. He used it with brutal precision. The flat of the spade caught Henderson under the chin with a sickening crack, knocking him clean out of his saddle. Before the other men could react, Caleb had wrenched Henderson's pistol from its holster. The world erupted into chaos. Gunshots exploded in the twilight air. But Caleb was no longer just a rancher defending his property. His war instincts, long buried, had taken over. He moved with an unnerving grace, using the wagon for cover, his shots methodical and deliberate. He was not trying to kill them. Evelyn realized with a jolt. He was aiming for shoulders, for legs. He was disabling them, taking them apart with the cold efficiency of a surgeon. One man cried out and clutched his arm, his rifle falling from his grasp. Another was knocked from his horse as Caleb's second shot found its mark. The remaining 2, seeing the fight was lost, turned their horses and fled into the growing darkness, leaving their wounded comrades behind. The entire exchange had lasted less than a minute. The sudden silence that fell was deafening, broken only by the groans of the injured men and the frantic pounding of Evelyn's own heart. Caleb stood over the fallen men, the pistol still steady in his hand, his chest rising and falling in deep, even breaths. He was a creature of violence, a man forged in a fire she could not comprehend. Evelyn was shaken to her very core. She had never witnessed such brutality up close, but as she looked at him, standing guard over what was theirs, a strange and unsettling emotion mixed with her fear. She was drawn to the fierce, unwavering loyalty that had driven him. He had fought like a demon, not for himself, but for this land, for the life they were trying to build. For her, in his own silent, violent way, he had protected her. Afterward, he was a stranger again. He made the wounded men tie their own tourniquets, then sent them away on their horses with a cold command to never return. He did not speak to Evelyn. He went into the house, found the bottle of whiskey he kept hidden in a floorboard, and began to drink. He drank heavily, with a grim determination, as if trying to drown the man he had just been. Evelyn watched him, her fear giving way to a deep, aching pity. The violence had not empowered him. It had shamed him. Later, she saw him trying to clean a long gash on his forearm where one of the men had caught him with a knife. His hands, clumsy with whiskey, were shaking. She went to him, her own hands trembling. She took the cloth and the bottle of carbolic from him. He didn't resist. He sat at the table, his head bowed, as she gently cleaned the wound. The cut was deep, but not serious. His blood stained the white cloth. She worked in silence, her touch as gentle as she could make it. "You're still human," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. A shudder ran through his entire body. A low, guttural sound escaped his lips, a sound of such profound agony that it broke her heart. He covered his face with his hands, and his broad shoulders began to shake. He was breaking down, the walls he had so carefully constructed crumbling into dust. "It was my fault," he choked out, the words muffled by his hands. "Martha, it was my fault." Evelyn froze. She had wondered for so long, and now the confession was pouring out of him, brought on by whiskey and violence and shame. "The raid," he said, his voice ragged with a grief so old and so deep it was a part of his bones. "I knew they were in the area. The army sent a warning. I should have stayed. I should have taken her into town, but I was stubborn. There was a fence that needed mending on the North Ridge, a damned fence. I thought I would be back before nightfall." He dropped his hands and looked at her, his eyes swimming with unshed tears and a self-loathing that was terrible to behold. "I wasn't home when they came. I was mending a fence while she—" He couldn't finish. He didn't have to. "I found her. In here. I should have been here. It was my fault." The confession hung in the small, lamp-lit room, a weight of unbearable guilt. Evelyn looked at this broken man, and she felt the immensity of his suffering. He was not just grieving a wife. He was living a life sentence for a crime he had convicted himself of. She knew she was supposed to offer absolution, to say the words, "It wasn't your fault," but they would have been a lie, a hollow comfort that he would not have believed. His guilt was a part of him now. So she did not forgive him, but she did not leave him, either. She simply stayed, kneeling by his chair, her hand resting lightly on his uninjured arm. Her presence was her only answer. That night, the silence in the house changed. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the raw, exposed wounds of his confession. Grief and shame and a desperate, aching loneliness filled the space between them until it became something else, something physical and charged. Later, as he sat staring at the cold ashes in the hearth, she went to him and laid a hand on his shoulder. He turned his head and looked at her. The whiskey had softened the hard lines of his face, leaving him vulnerable, his eyes full of a desperate pleading. He reached up and touched her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. It was not a gesture of affection. It was a question. It was a plea for something he could not name. He was asking for absolution. For a moment of forgetfulness, for a human touch to anchor him in the storm of his own memory. She did not pull away. She saw the drowning man Tom had spoken of, and in that moment, she was willing to be pulled under with him. She let him. Their first night together was a desperate, wordless collision of two lonely souls. It was not gentle or tender. It was full of a raw, aching longing, a frantic attempt to close a gap that was too wide for words. His touch was not that of a lover, but of a penitent seeking forgiveness in her skin. And she, in her own vast emptiness, accepted his grief, his desperation, his need, and offered her own in return. It was a moment of pure, unvarnished humanity. Two broken people clinging to each other in the dark. The morning came too soon, the harsh light of a new day spilling into the room, chasing away the shadows and the fragile intimacy of the night. Evelyn woke first. She was tangled in the blankets with him, his arm heavy across her waist. For a fleeting moment, a sense of peace settled over her. Then he stirred. He opened his eyes, and when he saw her lying beside him, the vulnerability of the night was gone. A shutter came down, his face closing off, becoming a mask of stone once more. He pulled his arm away as if her skin had burned him. He sat up, his back to her, and the chasm between them opened up again, wider and deeper than before. He dressed in silence. Evelyn lay there, the sheet pulled up to her chin, her heart a cold, heavy knot in her chest. As he stood by the door, ready to face the day, he paused, but he still could not look at her. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp of regret. The words were a slap in the face. He was not talking about what he had done, but what she had allowed. He was placing the shame of it on her. He left the room, his footsteps heavy on the floorboards, leaving her alone with the echo of his words. A crack formed in Evelyn's heart, a deep, splintering fracture. The tiny seed of hope that had been planted by a storm and a name was now crushed. She had offered comfort to a drowning man, and in the light of day, he was ashamed of the hand that had kept him afloat. In that moment, staring at the empty doorway, Evelyn realized a devastating truth. Love with a broken man, a man who could not forgive himself, was not a sanctuary. It was its own kind of prison. The morning after Caleb's confession was a fragile dawn, the light thin and pale. His words, "You shouldn't have done that," had rebuilt the wall between them. But this time, Evelyn knew the bricks were made of shame, not coldness. The days that followed were a silent penance. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate distance, the memory of their desperate intimacy a raw and unhealed wound. They were no longer just strangers bound by a transaction. They were two people burdened by a shared secret that had no name. The prison had new walls, invisible but stronger than ever. It was the outside world that broke the silence. Word of the fight at the Hart Ranch had traveled back to Dry Creek on the lips of the wounded men. In the telling and retelling, the story twisted and grew darker. A desperate fight for cattle became a brutal ambush. A man defending his home became a killer. The whispers grew into a rumor, and the rumor finally took on the weight of an accusation. Caleb Hart had killed a man during the raid. One afternoon, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. It was Sheriff Brody, a tall, weary man whose face was a roadmap of the troubles he'd seen. He rode not with the urgency of an accuser, but with the slow, reluctant pace of a man doing a job he didn't enjoy. Caleb saw him coming and his body went still. He was standing by the corral, and he simply stopped, his eyes fixed on the approaching lawman. Evelyn, who was scrubbing a pot on the porch steps, felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She rose, wiping her wet hands on her apron, and stood beside Caleb. They presented a united front, two silent figures waiting for the world to pass its judgment. "Caleb," the sheriff said, reining in his horse. He nodded at Evelyn. "Ma'am." He didn't dismount. a sign that this was official business. "I'm here about the trouble the other night. Henderson's youngest boy. Jeb, he didn't make it back. They found him in a ravine 2 days ago. He'd lost a lot of blood." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She risked a glance at Caleb. His face was unreadable, carved from granite. He had not told her. He had carried this knowledge alone, her secret fear, the one that whispered to her in the dark, now had a name: Jeb. "The other men are saying you shot him down in cold blood," Sheriff Brody continued, his voice tired. "Saying you were waiting for them. I need to know what happened out here." This was her moment, her crossroads. She could tell the truth as she saw it. A brutal, efficient fight that she did not fully understand. She could remain silent, a wife who knew her place, or she could lie. She looked at Caleb, at the deep, unending sorrow in his eyes, at the man who had burned his Bible because he could not find forgiveness in its pages. She thought of the shame that had driven him from her side after he had sought solace in her arms. She saw the drowning man, and she made her choice. She stepped forward slightly, her voice clear and steady, though her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. "Sheriff, my husband was defending our home. Those men came here to steal from us. They were armed, and they were threatening. Caleb did what any man would do. He protected his wife and his property. It was a fair fight, and they were the ones who started it." Sheriff Brody looked at her, his gaze sharp and assessing. He then shifted his eyes to Caleb, who remained silent, letting her words stand for him. The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. He knew the Hendersons. He knew their desperation and their hot-headedness. He also knew Caleb Hart's reputation. "A fair fight that leaves a boy dead is still a dead boy," he said, more to himself than to them. He scanned the yard, the half-dug well, the parched land. He saw the story of a struggle, not of an ambush. "I'll put it down as self-defense, but you watch your back. Caleb, the Hendersons won't see it that way. This isn't over." With a final, somber nod, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and an uneasy peace in his wake. For a long time after he was gone, neither of them moved. The silence was thick with unspoken gratitude and shared fear. Evelyn turned to go back to her work, the adrenaline leaving her weak and trembling. She picked up the pot she had been scrubbing, her hands shaking so much the metal rattled against the stone step. "Thank you." The words were spoken so quietly, she almost didn't hear them. Caleb was standing behind her. She turned. He was looking at her, really looking at her, and the wall between them was gone. In his eyes was a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored the night of his confession. She simply nodded, unable to speak. He reached out and placed his hand over hers on the handle of the pot, stilling its trembling. His touch was warm and firm. His calloused fingers covered her own, and for a moment, he just held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it gently. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound connection. A silent acknowledgement of the lie she had told for him, of the burden she had chosen to share. His hand lingered there, a quiet promise in a world of harsh words. That night, something shifted between them. The careful distance was replaced by a tentative closeness. After their sparse meal, he did not retreat into silence. He began to talk. He spoke of the war, not in a single, coherent story, but in broken fragments, like shards of a shattered mirror. He spoke of the endless marches, the gnawing hunger, the constant fear. He spoke of the things he had been ordered to do, things that had stained his soul. "We burned a whole town once," he said, his voice a low, haunted murmur as he stared into the fire. "They said there were soldiers hiding there, but all I saw were farms, homes. We lit the torches, the smell of burning pine and something else, something sickeningly sweet." He paused, his eyes unfocused, seeing ghosts in the flames. "I remember the screams of the innocents. They don't ever leave you." His nightmares, which had been a low, guttural affair of muffled groans. Worsened. He would wake up thrashing, crying out names that were not Martha's, shouting orders in a voice that was not his own. He would sit bolt upright, his body drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with a terror that saw battlefields in the shadows of their small room. Evelyn, waking to his cries, did not know what to do. Words of comfort felt hollow and useless against such deep-seated horror. So she found another way. She began to keep a small lantern lit all night. Its wick turned down low. It cast a soft, steady glow, a small circle of light that held the deepest shadows at bay. When he woke from his terrors, he would see the gentle light, and then he would see her, sitting in a chair across the room, a silent sentinel watching over his troubled sleep. She would not speak, but her presence was a constant, calming anchor. He was not alone in the dark. Their bond deepened, built not on declarations of love, but on these shared, sleepless nights. It was forged in whispered apologies from him for waking her, and in the silent shake of her head that told him it didn't matter. It grew in the long, quiet hours before dawn, when the ghosts of his past felt most real, and her quiet presence was his only shield. They were two solitary people learning to stand together against the darkness, both within and without. One evening, she found him on the porch, a piece of wood in his hand and a small whittling knife in the other. He was carving, his rough hands moving with a surprising delicacy and concentration. She watched him for a while, the soft scrape of the knife the only sound. When he was finished, he held it out to her. It was a small comb, carved from a piece of pale willow wood from the very spot where they had dug for water. It was simple, but beautifully made. The teeth were fine and even, the back smoothed into a gentle curve that fit perfectly in her palm. It was the first gift he had ever given her. It was the first beautiful thing she had held since she had come to this place. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the evening air. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He just nodded, a faint flush on his weathered cheeks, and looked away toward the horizon, but she had seen the look in his eyes, a shy, hopeful pride. A few nights later, a rare coolness had settled over the land. They had finished their work, and a quiet peace filled the evening. Evelyn felt a strange, unbidden impulse. "Let's go to the barn," she said. He looked at her, a question in his eyes, but he followed her. The barn was cavernous in the moonlight that streamed through the open doors, smelling of hay and horse and dry earth. The air was still and quiet. "Dance with me," she said softly. He looked at her as if she were mad. "There's no music." "We don't need music," she replied. She kicked off her worn shoes, her bare feet sinking into the soft dust and scattered straw on the barn floor. She held out her hands to him. He hesitated for a long moment. She saw the conflict in his face, the old habit of refusal warring with a new desire to connect. Then, slowly, he took her hands. His were large and rough, hers small and, despite the calluses, still soft in his grip. And so they danced, barefoot on the dusty planks of the barn floor, with only the silver light of the moon for a witness and the sound of the crickets for a fiddler. It was a slow, clumsy shuffle at first, but then they found a rhythm. He pulled her closer, his hand resting on the small of her back. She laid her head against his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her ear. They moved as one, a silent, swaying dance with music only in their memories. In that moment, there were no ghosts, no debts, no drought. There was only the quiet scrape of their feet on the floor, the warmth of his hand, and the simple, profound peace of being held. But peace, in that land, was a fleeting guest. The fragile world they had built in the darkness and the silence was about to be shattered by the undeniable intrusion of life. A few weeks after their dance in the barn, Evelyn began to feel a change within herself, a morning sickness that left her weak and dizzy, a new tenderness in her body, a deep, bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with hard labor. She knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that she was pregnant. For several days, she held the secret close, a small, precious flame cupped in her hands. In this place of death and decay, she was nurturing a new beginning. A fierce, protective joy rose in her, so powerful it almost eclipsed her fear. She chose a quiet evening to tell him. He was repairing a bridle by the light of the fire, his face softened by the flickering glow. "Caleb," she began, her voice trembling slightly. We are going to have a child." The piece of leather and the awl fell from his hands. He stared at her, his face draining of all color. She had expected surprise, perhaps even a hesitant smile. She had not expected the raw, absolute terror that filled his eyes. It was the look he'd had the night of the storm, the look of a man facing his deepest, most primal fear. He rose to his feet, backing away from her as if she had just pronounced a death sentence. "No," he whispered, the word a choked, desperate plea. He looked around the small, grim house, at the shadows in the corners, at the empty chair where a ghost still sat. He looked out the window at the barren, unforgiving land. "This land," he muttered, his voice breaking, his eyes wild with a terrible, fatalistic certainty. "This land takes everything I love." Before she could say a word, before she could reach for him, he turned and fled. He burst out the door and into the night, where a storm was gathering on the horizon, mirroring the one in his soul. A few moments later, she heard the frantic beat of a horse's hooves, galloping away into the darkness, away from her, away from the life she carried. She waited. For 3 days, she waited. She did her chores, her movements mechanical, her heart a hollow ache in her chest. She tended the animals, hauled the water, and stared at the empty horizon until her eyes burned. The tiny flame of hope she had so carefully nurtured guttered and died, leaving her in a cold, lonely darkness. He was not coming back. He had chosen his ghosts over her. On the evening of the 3rd day, the storm that had threatened finally broke. The sky opened up, and the rain came down. A hard, steady, life-giving downpour that the thirsty land drank in greedily. In the midst of that storm, she saw him, a lone figure on a weary horse, riding slowly toward the house. He did not ride to the barn. He stopped in front of the porch and slid from the saddle, his movements stiff and exhausted. He was mud-stained and hollow-eyed, as if he had ridden to the edge of the world and back. In his hand, he clutched a small, bedraggled bouquet of wildflowers, their purple and yellow heads drooping in the rain. He walked to the porch and stood before her, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead and dripping from the brim of his hat. He looked like a man who had wrestled with demons and barely won. He held out the flowers, a pathetic, beautiful offering. He tried to speak, but his voice caught. He swallowed hard and tried again. "I can't promise to live," he said, his voice breaking on the words, raw with an honesty that stripped him bare. "The world is a hard place. I don't know if I'm strong enough for it." He looked into her eyes, and she saw the full depth of his fear and his love. "But I'll promise you forever. For as long as I have, I'm yours." Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain. She did not take the flowers. She stepped into his arms, wrapping them around his neck, holding onto him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was washing away. He held her just as tightly, his face buried in her hair, his body trembling. They stood there on the porch, holding each other as the rain washed over them, a cleansing, healing torrent that promised not an end to suffering, but the strength to endure it, together. Caleb's promise, whispered in the rain, was a seed planted in cracked, desperate earth. For a time, Evelyn allowed herself to believe it might grow. They fell into a new, fragile rhythm, a partnership forged in shared hardship and whispered confessions. He began to touch her with a gentleness that belied his rough hands. A simple brush of fingers as he passed her a cup of water, a steadying hand on her back as she navigated the uneven ground. They spoke more, not of the past, but of the future, a future that was now inextricably linked to the tiny, secret life growing within her. But the land itself was hostile to new life. The rain that had brought Caleb home was a fleeting mercy. The drought returned with a vengeance, tightening its grip like a fist around the throat of the world. The sun baked the sky to a milky, unforgiving white. The heat was a constant, suffocating presence, and the dust was in everything: the water, the food, their lungs. The pregnancy was difficult. The hope it represented was at war with the desolation that surrounded them. Evelyn grew weak. The morning sickness was a relentless thief, stealing what little strength she gained from their meager meals. A deep, profound weariness settled into her bones, one that sleep could not erase. She moved through her chores in a haze of fatigue, her body feeling heavy and alien. The child within her was a precious, desperate anchor, but it was also a drain on her dwindling reserves in a land that offered no replenishment. The prejudice in Dry Creek, once a current of whispers, became a cruel, open torrent. On a necessary trip for salt and flour, Evelyn felt the change. The women who had once sneered at her for being bought cheap now looked at her burgeoning belly with a mixture of scorn and a kind of superstitious fear. Their whispers followed her from the store, sharp and venomous as nettles. "Look at her!" one woman hissed to another, just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. "Trying to raise a child in that house of ghosts. It's unnatural." "The land itself has rejected that place," the other replied, her eyes cold. "Nothing good can grow there. She's cursed, same as the first one was." The words were a physical blow, striking at the most vulnerable part of her. She hurried back to the wagon, her face pale, her hands trembling. She did not tell Caleb what they had said, but he saw the look in her eyes. That evening, he worked late into the night, reinforcing the corral fence with a silent, furious energy, as if he could build a wall strong enough to keep out the world's cruelty. He worked himself to the brink of collapse. He saw Evelyn's weakness, and it fed a desperate terror in him, the one he had confessed in the storm, that the land, and perhaps God himself, took everything he loved. He fought against this fate with the only weapons he had, his own 2 hands and an unbreakable will. He rose hours before dawn and worked until long after the sun had set, a solitary figure battling a losing war against the dying land. He dug 2 more wells, his shovel striking only dry rock and mockery. He rode for miles in search of grazing for the last few skeletal cattle. He refused all help. When the widow Agnes Miller rode over one day and offered the assistance of her 2 grown sons, Caleb politely but firmly declined. "This is my burden," was all he said. Evelyn saw it was more than that. It was his penance. He was trying to pay the debt of guilt he felt he owed to Martha by sacrificing his own body for Evelyn and their unborn child. He was trying to outwork the curse. The curse, however, came not from the land, but from the hearts of men. It came on a moonless, starless night, when the air was still and thick with heat. Evelyn was asleep, and, for once, her sleep was deep. A sudden, sharp crackle woke her. It was a sound that did not belong in the quiet of the night. Then came another, louder sound, a hungry, violent roar. She sat up, her heart pounding. A hellish orange light was flickering against the bedroom window. Smoke. She could smell smoke. "Caleb!" she cried, shaking him. He was already moving, his soldier's instincts pulling him from sleep into immediate, alert action. He was at the window in an instant, his face grim in the demonic glow. "The barn," he said, his voice a low, hard growl. They burst out of the house. The sight that met them was a vision from hell. The barn was fully engulfed. a raging inferno that painted the night sky in horrifying shades of orange and red. Flames licked up the dry timber, devouring the structure that was the heart of their livelihood. Trapped inside. The two horses screamed, a sound of pure terror and agony that would haunt Evelyn for the rest of her days. And, in the flickering firelight, she saw them, a group of about a half-dozen men on horseback, their faces hidden by bandanas. Vigilantes. At the front, she recognized the big bearded frame of Henderson, the father of the boy who had died. They were not there to steal. They were there for vengeance.
"This is justice! Heart!"
Henderson bellowed over the roar of the fire.
"An eye for an eye! Your ranch for my boy!"
Caleb did not reach for his rifle. He stood frozen for a half-second, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The fire was not just destroying his barn, it was destroying his chance at redemption. Then his focus shifted. The horses. He started toward the burning structure, a desperate, suicidal impulse to save the animals.
"No, Caleb, you cannot!"
Evelyn screamed, grabbing his arm. But her own panic was rising. The barn held their winter stores, their tools, the wagon, everything they needed to survive. Without thinking, driven by a frantic need to save something, she picked up a water bucket and ran toward the well.
"Evelyn, no! Get back in the house!"
Caleb roared, his voice thick with a terror that was not for the barn, but for her. She ignored him, her mind consumed by a single, desperate thought: to fight. She worked the pump, her movements clumsy in her panic, and started back toward the flames, the meager splash of water in the bucket a pathetic offering against the inferno. A wave of thick, acrid smoke billowed out from the collapsing structure, engulfing her. It was hot and suffocating, a physical fist that punched the air from her lungs. She choked, her eyes streaming, her vision swimming. The world tilted, the orange glow of the fire spiraling into a dizzying vortex. She stumbled, a sharp, cramping pain seizing her belly. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Caleb's face, a mask of sheer terror. As he ran toward her, his arms outstretched, he caught her as she fell, lifting her from the ground as if she weighed nothing. He did not spare a glance for the burning barn or the men who had condemned them. He carried her back to the house. His world narrowed to the fragile, precious weight in his arms. Grief is a silence. After the fire, after the vigilantes had ridden off into the night, their vengeance sated, after the barn had collapsed into a smoldering, blackened skeleton, a new silence fell upon the house. It was deeper and more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a future that had been stolen. The smoke, the fall, the terror. It had been too much for Evelyn's weakened body. The small, fragile life she had carried was lost. The widow Agnes, her face a mask of grim pity, had come and done what she could, but there was nothing to be done. The house became a tomb. They moved through the rooms like ghosts, their bodies still present, but their spirits gone. They did not speak of what had happened. There were no words vast enough to contain such a loss. Caleb's guilt, which had been a heavy cloak, was now a crushing weight that bowed his shoulders and hollowed out his eyes. He had failed again. He had brought another curse upon another life he loved. He had promised her forever, and all he had delivered was another grave. Evelyn felt as though she were suffocating. The very air in the house was thick with loss, the ghost of Martha, the ghost of their unborn child, the ghost of the hope they had briefly shared. Every corner held a memory of what might have been. The small wooden comb he had carved for her felt like a cruel joke. The silence was no longer a space they could share. It was a chasm that separated them completely. About a week after the fire, she made her decision. She could not heal here. She could not even breathe. She took out the small cloth bundle she had arrived with. There was nothing to add to it. She smoothed the fabric of her spare dress, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were a stranger watching her own hands. Caleb found her by the door, the bundle in her hand, her shawl around her shoulders. He did not ask where she was going. He knew. His face was a study in desolation. He looked like a man who had already lost everything and was now simply watching the final piece of wreckage float away. "I cannot breathe here anymore," she whispered, her voice a dry, broken thing. "There is too much loss. It is in the walls, in the air." She looked at him, her heart aching with a love that was now intertwined with an unbearable sorrow. "I am sorry." He did not try to stop her. He did not speak. He did not reach for her. He simply stood there, his hands hanging limp at his sides, and watched her. His silence was not born of anger or indifference. It was a form of surrender. He believed he was the source of the curse, the poison in the well. To let her go was, in his mind, the only act of love he had left to give. It was his final, terrible penance. She turned and walked away. She did not look back. She untied one of the horses, spared only because it had been in a far pasture, and pulled herself into the saddle. She rode away into the gray, colorless light of a new dawn, leaving behind the smoking ruins of a barn and the silent, broken man who was her husband. The ride to Dry Creek was a blur. She was numb, moving through a world that seemed distant and unreal. She did not guide the horse. She simply let it walk, its slow, plodding gait a funereal rhythm. When the small, dusty town came into view, she felt no sense of relief. It was not a destination. It was just the end of the line. She slid from the horse's back in front of the small white church. The bell she had once longed to hear was silent. The steps seemed to rise up before her like a mountain. She was seeking a sanctuary that she no longer believed in. She took one step, then another. Her vision began to swim, black spots dancing at the edges. The world tilted on its axis, and the gray dawn dissolved into a final, welcoming darkness. She collapsed on the church steps. She woke to a circle of faces looking down at her. They were the women from the town, the ones who had whispered and sneered. But the cruelty was gone from their eyes. In its place was something she had not expected. Pity. It was a hard, unsentimental pity, born of a shared understanding of the brutality of life. They saw not the cursed woman from the House of Ghosts, but a woman who had lost a child, a woman who was alone and broken, in the harsh calculus of the frontier. Her tragedy had made her one of them. A firm, capable hand touched her forehead. "Give her some air," a familiar voice commanded. Evelyn looked up into the kind, sad eyes of the widow Agnes Miller. Agnes shooed the other women away and helped Evelyn to her feet, her strong arm a steady support. "Come with me, child," she said softly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You will stay with me." Agnes gave her a small, clean room in her own sturdy, silent house. She gave her broth and bread and left her alone with her grief for days. Evelyn did little more than sleep and stare out the window. The window faced east, toward the vast, empty plains, toward the place she had fled. Every night, she would sit by that window and watch the stars appear in the dark, indifferent sky. The love she had felt for Caleb had not died. It was still there, a hot, aching coal in the ashes of her heart. But she began to wonder if that love was just another cruel trick of the West, another beautiful thing destined to be ground into the dust. She had whispered a promise to herself that she would not break, but she felt herself shattering into 1,000 pieces. She stared out at the dark horizon, wondering if a future could ever be built from such complete and utter ruin. The weeks Evelyn spent at Agnes Miller's ranch were a time of gray stillness. Her body slowly healed from its ordeal, the physical pain receding into a dull, persistent ache that was a constant reminder of the emptiness within her. She moved through the days in a fog of quiet grief, helping Agnes with the mending and the cooking, her hands performing the tasks while her mind remained far away. Fixed on a ruined homestead to the west, the pity of the townsfolk, which had at first been a strange comfort, soon began to feel like another kind of cage. Their soft words and sad glances defined her by her tragedy, cementing her role as a victim of the cursed heartland. She was a story they told each other. A cautionary tale of a woman who had dared to love a haunted man. Her nights were the worst. She would lie in the small, clean bed and stare out at the vast, star-strewn sky. A sky that looked down on Caleb, wherever he was. Was he alive? Was he dead? Had he simply walked away from the ashes? A ghost returning to the wilderness? The not knowing was a special kind of torture, a wound that could not scar over. Love, she decided, was not a trick of the West. It was its most fundamental truth. It was a fierce and desperate instinct for survival, a stubborn weed that grew in the most unforgiving soil, and it was a pain that was sharper than any blade. The news, when it came, was not a letter or a messenger, but a rumor, carried on the dusty wind like a plague. A freight driver, passing through Dry Creek on his way north, told the story over a beer in the saloon. The Henderson clan, not satisfied with their first act of vengeance, had returned to the Hart place. They had finished the job, burning the house to the ground this time. The place was nothing but ash and charcoal. Of Caleb Hart, there was no sign. Most assumed he was dead, caught in the flames, his body consumed by the fire his own past had ignited. The rumor spread through the town like a grass fire. When Agnes told Evelyn, her voice was soft with pity, her hand resting gently on Evelyn's shoulder. She was delivering a death sentence, but Evelyn did not hear the finality in her words. She heard only one thing: no sign of him. The ambiguity was not a source of pain, but a tiny, impossible sliver of light in the overwhelming darkness. It was a chance. It meant that he might still be out there. The thought was a jolt to her listless heart, a sudden, fierce current that pulled her from the gray fog of her grief. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, what she had to do. That night, she packed her small bundle. She wrote a note for Agnes, the words of gratitude feeling hopelessly inadequate. Before dawn, while the house was still and quiet, she slipped out to the corral. She saddled the horse she had ridden from the ranch, its familiar, solid presence a comfort in the pre-dawn chill. She did not know what she would find. She might be riding toward a grave, toward the final confirmation of her deepest fears. But she had to know. She could not live the rest of her life in the prison of not knowing. She rode west, alone, into the dust and the ruin. A woman no longer fleeing a tragedy, but seeking a truth, whatever it might be. The journey back was a pilgrimage through a dead land. The world was shades of brown and gray, the earth parched, the sky a pale, hazy canvas. The ruins of their life appeared first as a dark smudge on the horizon. As she drew closer, the full extent of the devastation revealed itself. It was a scene of utter annihilation. The barn was a collapsed skeleton of blackened timbers, and the house was gone. Where their small, grim home had stood, there was now only a pile of charred rubble, a few stone foundation blocks, and a blackened chimney stack pointing to the sky like a crooked finger accusing a merciless god. The air still smelled of ash and sorrow. Evelyn dismounted, her legs unsteady. She walked through the ruins, her worn shoes scuffing through the gray, powdery remains of their life. The comb he had carved her was in her pocket, a small, smooth piece of wood that was the only tangible thing left. She walked to the small, fenced-in hill. Martha's grave was undisturbed, the simple wooden cross still standing, and next to it, there was a new mound of earth, smaller, marked by a simple pile of stones, the grave of their child. A dry, ragged sob escaped her lips. She turned from the graves, her eyes scanning the desolation, searching for, what? A sign, a body, an answer. And then she saw it, a movement, near what was left of the corral, a figure, bent low to the ground. It was Caleb. He was alive. The word was a silent scream in her soul, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. He was alive. He was filthy, his clothes torn and stained with soot. His hair was matted with dirt, and a long, ugly burn ran down one side of his face, red and raw. He was trying to straighten a series of charred fence posts with his bare hands, a futile, impossible task. He moved with a slow, agonizing stiffness, every motion an obvious effort of will against profound pain and exhaustion. He looked like a ghost, a man haunted by the ruins of his own life. But he was alive. She walked toward him, her footsteps silent in the soft ash. He did not hear her until she was only a few feet away. He looked up slowly, his eyes dull and unfocused. When he saw her, a look of profound shock washed over his face, followed by a deep, wrenching shame. He looked away, as if he could not bear for her to see him like this, so utterly broken. "Evelyn," he breathed, his voice a hoarse, cracked whisper. She knelt in the dust beside him, her own grief momentarily forgotten in the face of his raw suffering. She reached out and gently touched his arm. He flinched, but did not pull away. "They told me you were dead," she said, her voice trembling. He gave a short, bitter laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "Maybe I am," he said, his gaze fixed on the ruin of their home. Henderson and his brothers came back. They wanted to finish the job. "You fought them," she said, a statement, not a question. He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were clear, filled with a terrible, weary clarity. "No," he said softly. "I did not fight. I couldn't, not again. I could not bear to kill again. Not even for this." He gestured to the surrounding devastation. He looked at his own hands, scraped and raw from his work. "When they lit the fire, I just stood there. I let it burn." He looked back at her, his face a mask of utter desolation. "Maybe this is justice. For Jeb Henderson. For Martha. For everything." He had reached the very bottom of his despair. He had accepted his damnation, welcoming the fire as a righteous punishment for his sins. Evelyn looked at this man, this soldier, this farmer, this husband, who had been stripped of everything, who believed he deserved nothing but ash, and she knew that pity would be an insult. Forgiveness was not hers to give. What he needed was a truth harder and cleaner than either. She reached out and took his wounded, dirty hand in hers. "Justice doesn't bring the dead back, Caleb," she said, her voice soft but firm, cutting through his haze of guilt. "It just makes more ghosts." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. A tremor ran through his entire body. He stared at her, his eyes wide, as if she had spoken a language he had long forgotten. The terrible, rigid control he had maintained for so long finally shattered. His face crumpled. A low, ragged sound was torn from his throat, and for the first time since she had known him, Caleb Hart cried. He did not weep silently. He sobbed. Great, shuddering, body-racking sobs that came from a place of grief so deep it had nearly drowned him. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of years of unshed tears for his dead wife, for his lost child, for the men he had killed, for the man he had become. It was a storm of pure, undiluted agony. Evelyn did not speak. She simply moved closer and wrapped her arms around him, holding his shaking body as he fell apart. She held him there, kneeling in the ashes of their life, and let him cry until the storm passed, leaving in its wake a quiet, exhausted peace. They rebuilt. The coming winter was a race against time. The first snows found them living in a crude, half-finished shelter, a single room built from salvaged timber and scavenged stone. It was not a house. It was a testament to their shared will to survive. They worked from the gray light of dawn to the purple twilight of dusk, side by side. Their silence was different now. It was not a wall between them, but a shared space, a quiet understanding that needed no words. Their movements became a language of their own, the passing of a hammer, the steadying of a beam, the sharing of a piece of hardtack and a sip of water. The winter was harsh, a long season of biting wind and deep, heavy snow. It was a time of healing. Evelyn's hands, once soft, were now calloused and capable. She learned to set a snare, to patch a roof, to see the beauty in the stark, frozen landscape. Caleb's wounds, both visible and invisible, slowly began to scar over. He still had nightmares, but now, when he woke, he would reach for her hand in the dark, and she would be there, a warm, solid presence that anchored him to the living world. The snow fell over the land, a soft, white blanket that covered the scars of the fire and the drought. It fell over the grave of their unborn child, and over Martha's resting place on the hill. It did not erase the past, but it softened its harsh outlines, bringing a measure of peace to the wounded earth, and to the two souls who lived upon it. One night, the winter broke for a moment, and a full moon rose in a clear, cold sky. It flooded their small shelter with a brilliant silver light, illuminating the new, raw wood of the walls and the peaceful, sleeping face of the man beside her. The snow-covered world outside was silent, beautiful, and stark. Evelyn lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of Caleb's breathing. She thought of the promise she had made to herself in this very place, what felt like a lifetime ago, a promise made in fear and defiance. Now, it was a simple statement of fact. She reached out and gently touched his shoulder. He stirred, his eyes opening. He looked at her in the moonlight, his gaze clear and full of a quiet, wondering love. "I will not break," she whispered, the words she had once said to herself, now a vow to him. A slow smile touched his lips, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his weary face. "You never did," he answered, his voice soft with a reverence that made her heart ache. He was the one who was broken, and she had been his strength. She was the one who was bought, and she had been his salvation. As he shifted, his shadow fell over her, covering her in the soft darkness of the doorway. She reached up and took his hand, the hand that was scarred and calloused from war and work and rebuilding, and she lifted it to her heart, pressing his palm against the steady, rhythmic beat of her own life. "Promise me forever," she breathed, the words no longer a plea, but a quiet, certain demand. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that held no desperation, only a deep, abiding tenderness. She could feel the slight tremble in his body, the tremor of a man who had been to the edge of oblivion and had been called back. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closing. "Even if forever ends here," he nodded, his voice trembling with the weight of the promise. Outside, the land was still barren. The winter still held its grip, and the world was still a hard and unforgiving place. But inside the small shelter, surrounded by the ghosts they had finally learned to live with, love had, at last, outlived the pain. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And we invite you to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.